Selection. The word sliced through the hot air like a blade. Everyone out. Line up for selection. The sun burned over the Texas plains, turning the air into a shimmering veil of heat. A convoy of olive trucks rolled through a cloud of dust toward a fenced compound outside Hearn, Texas. Inside the back of one truck, 30 German women sat in silence, their uniforms faded, faces hollow from weeks of travel. No one spoke. Every bump in the road made the chains on the truck bed rattle like a warning. Ilsa Wagner, a 27-year-old nurse from Hamburg, held her breath as the truck stopped. The doors opened, and an American sergeant shouted the terrifying command. She had heard that word before in whispers, in stories about camps in the East, in rumors of people who never returned. She glanced at her friend Greta. Greta's lips moved silently. Not again. The women stepped down into the blinding light. Ahead of them stretched a long table beneath a canvas awning flanked by armed guards. Beyond the fence, the smell of smoke drifted across the yard. Someone was burning something. Ilsa's stomach twisted. Then she saw it. A column of black smoke curling into the sky. She thought she knew what came next. They stood in 2 rows as the sergeant walked down the line, clipboard in hand. His face was calm, unreadable. He stopped in front of Ilsa and asked, "You speak English?" She nodded faintly. "Good," he said. "You're assigned to kitchen duty." He pointed toward the smoke. "Barbecue day." For a heartbeat, Ilsa didn't understand. The word sounded wrong. Barbecue. She looked around. Instead of trucks for deportation, she saw a row of wooden tables stacked with pots, pans, and sacks of flour. American soldiers were unloading crates filled with vegetables, slabs of beef, and bottles of sauce. Civilians, ranchers in wide-brimmed hats, were laughing with the cooks. Another guard called out, "Y'all ready to cook?" The German women exchanged confused looks. Then one soldier handed each of them a white apron. No chains, no shackles, just aprons. Ilsa felt her knees weaken. A cowboy with sunburned skin and kind eyes stepped forward. "Don't just stand there, ma'am," he said. "We're fixing to eat." He handed her a spoon the size of a shovel. Behind him, music drifted from a radio. Soft country tunes mingling with the hiss of meat on the grill. The smoke she had feared wasn't from bodies or buildings. It was hickory and mesquite rising from open pits. For the first time in months, Ilsa smelled food that wasn't powdered or boiled grey. The aroma hit her like a memory of another life. She wanted to cry, but swallowed hard. Greta whispered, "They're feeding us." Ilsa couldn't answer. One by one, the women were guided to a long wooden table. Piles of bread, bowls of beans, plates already waiting. The Americans sat among them, talking easily, as if this gathering of enemies were the most ordinary thing in the world. Someone poured cold water into tin cups, and the ice clinked like music. Ilsa stared at her reflection in the cup surface. In it, she saw a woman who no longer understood the war. She lifted her gaze to the cowboy across from her. He raised his glass and said, "Welcome to Texas." In that moment, every wall she had built inside herself began to crumble. She had lined up for punishment, for judgment, for another act of cruelty. Instead, she had been chosen for mercy. Later she would write, "We were lined up for selection, yes, but for kindness, and that was harder to survive than fear." Before that day in Texas, Ilsa Wagner had already made peace with dying. When her field hospital was surrounded near Soltau, she expected execution or worse. The German soldiers she treated told her stories wild, exaggerated, but believable in a collapsing world. They said that captured women were paraded through towns, starved, humiliated. "The Americans," one officer swore, "will make you disappear." When the Americans finally took her prisoner, Ilsa waited for the cruelty to begin. Instead, she was given water. The soldier who handed her the canteen didn't look like the monster she'd imagined. He was young, freckles under his helmet, his uniform streaked with mud. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked quietly. The word "ma'am" stunned her more than the capture itself. No German soldier had ever called her that. For 2 weeks, the prisoners were transferred by train, crossing hundreds of miles. They passed through ports, ships, and finally into the endless plains of Texas. The land felt alien, flat, golden, stretching forever. The fences looked too thin to hold anyone. Ilsa thought, If they wanted to kill us, they wouldn't bring us here. Still, fear clung to her like a shadow. When they arrived at the camp, she noticed small details that confused her. There were gardens inside the fence, rows of tomatoes and corn. The barracks had screens on the windows to keep out mosquitoes. At the entrance, a painted sign read, Camp Hearn, POW Compound, United States Army. The words United States Army looked neat, official, almost polite. It didn't feel like the Reich's propaganda posters, where the enemy was always drawn as a beast. At night she lay awake, listening to the hum of crickets and the distant howl of coyotes. The sounds of Texas replaced the echoes of artillery. It felt too peaceful, too normal. That, she thought, must be part of the trick. The next morning, guards distributed small paper booklets, printed in both English and German. They were the Geneva Convention articles. One sentence stopped her cold. Prisoners of war shall be treated with humanity. She whispered the words to herself over and over again. Humanity. The concept felt like a rumor. Other women were just as skeptical. Greta muttered, "They're softening us up before the real work begins." Another woman laughed bitterly. "Maybe they'll feed us before they shoot us." No one believed the kindness would last. But as days passed, nothing cruel happened. The guards were firm but not violent. They addressed the women by rank, issued medical care, even dental checkups. A few Texans dropped off books and magazines at the camp library. Once Ilsa watched a guard help a German nurse fix a torn shoe. She couldn't decide if this was mercy or mockery. Each evening, the prisoners were counted, then allowed to walk the yard. Ilsa looked up at the wide Texan sky, so open, so endless, and thought, "We are trapped in freedom." Her fear didn't vanish overnight, but with each sunrise, it weakened. Slowly, against everything she'd been taught, she began to believe that survival might not require hatred. Later, she would remember that week not as imprisonment, but as the first time in years she felt safe enough to sleep without her boots on. By the summer of 1944, America had become the largest warden in the world. More than 425,000 Axis prisoners were scattered across the United States, living behind barbed wire, but surrounded by abundance. Texas alone held over 50 camps, from the pine forests of East Texas to the sunburned plains near El Paso. To the locals, it was strange, but not frightening. Ranchers and farmers called them the Germans, as if they were just another group of seasonal workers. Camp Hearn, where Ilsa Wagner was sent, was nicknamed the Fritz Ritz. Compared to Europe's devastation, it was almost a resort. The American policy was clear. Prisoners would be treated humanely, not just to honor the Geneva Convention, but as proof of moral strength. "We don't act like Nazis," one US officer said. "We win by being better." The contrast between German and American camps was almost beyond comprehension. In Germany, captured Allied soldiers were often kept in crumbling fortresses or open fields. Food was scarce, disease common. In Texas, by contrast, each prisoner received medical checkups, fresh uniforms, and 3 meals a day. The presence of these prisoners became part of daily life in towns like Hearn. The locals saw them at work in cotton fields, canneries, and sawmills. For many of the women, it was disorienting. They had grown up believing America was a nation of moral decay and chaos. Yet here, even the enemy seemed governed by a kind of order that Germany no longer knew. When Ilsa saw the camp doctor sterilize his instruments before treating a prisoner's toothache, she whispered to Greta, "Even their discipline is kind." Life in Camp Hearn settled into a rhythm. Roll call, breakfast, work details, rest, recreation. The women were allowed to write letters home, though everything was censored. Still, even a few words "I am alive" were precious. Over time, the line between captor and captive blurred. The Texans saw workers, not enemies. The Germans saw caretakers, not monsters. It was an uneasy peace, but peace nonetheless. For Ilsa, the realization came quietly one night as she watched the guards walk the fence line under the moon. She realized they weren't there to threaten her. They were there to make sure no one hurt her again. Inside the camp library, a stack of American newspapers told a story she could barely believe. In 1944 alone, The United States had produced 96,000 aircraft, nearly 20,000 tanks, and more trucks than the entire Axis alliance combined. The numbers looked impossible, like propaganda, yet outside her barracks, she could see the truth. Every crate, every uniform, every spoon was perfectly made, perfectly replaced. Nothing ever ran out. Each German prisoner received about 3,000 calories a day, more than many German civilians at home. Flour, beans, coffee, sugar, even meat appeared with mechanical regularity. Ilsa began to notice the rhythm of American logistics. The supply flow never stopped. It was like watching an empire powered not by conquest, but by competence. She began to compare it with what she knew of the Reich. In Germany, shortages were patriotic suffering. "Tighten your belt for victory," the radio had said. Here, the guards complained if the coffee ran cold. Greta, sitting beside her in the mess hall, once muttered, "This is wasteful." Ilsa shook her head. "No," she said softly, "it's strength." The American abundance was a weapon in itself, silent but devastating. Every plate of food told the same message: we can do this forever. You cannot. Even the Red Cross inspectors, neutral and precise, seemed impressed. They recorded the camp's statistics: mortality rate under 1%, full compliance with the Geneva Convention. The math was brutal and undeniable. America had turned compassion into a machine. While the Reich rationed starvation, the United States mass-produced mercy. Ilsa's diary from that period captured the irony in a single line: "We thought they would humiliate us with power. Instead, they humbled us with kindness." As weeks passed, that kindness began to work like an acid, eating away the fear and pride that had kept her loyal to a dying cause. For the first time, she wondered if defeat might be the beginning of something better. Because in Texas, even the enemy ate well, and that, more than any battle, showed who had truly won the war. The day the women were assigned to work on the ranch was the day Ilsa Wagner finally understood that Texas was unlike anything she'd ever imagined. A group of guards escorted them through a gate that opened into miles of open pasture. The air smelled of hay and sunlight. In the distance, cattle grazed lazily beneath the wide blue sky. A tall man in a hat approached, boots crunching against the dust. He wasn't a soldier. He was a cowboy. "Name's Tom," he said, tipping his hat. "Don't worry, ladies. You're safe here." The women stared at him, unsure how to react. His tone wasn't condescending or cruel. It was friendly, casual, as if he were greeting guests instead of prisoners. "We're short on hands. You help out, we feed you, right? Fair deal." The morning passed quietly. The women worked side by side with the ranchers, repairing fences, hauling water, cleaning stalls. The cowboys didn't watch them like guards. They talked, laughed, and even shared jokes they half understood. When one woman stumbled carrying a pail, a ranch hand caught it before it spilled. "Easy there, miss," he said, grinning. "Ain't no war here." At noon, the smell of grilled meat filled the air. Then, one of the Texans walked up, holding a tin plate stacked with thick slices of beef and bread. "Lunchtime?" he announced. Ilsa realized something strange. The cowboys didn't see them as prisoners. They saw them as people. After the meal, Tom showed them how to ride the horses that roamed the ranch. At first, the idea seemed ridiculous. Prisoners didn't get to ride horses, but he insisted. And soon a handful of women were laughing nervously as they tried to balance in the saddle. Greta, who hadn't smiled in months, shouted with delight when her horse started trotting. For a few brief moments, the war disappeared. That night, back in the camp, Ilsa couldn't sleep. The image of the open fields haunted her. It wasn't just the beauty of Texas, it was the freedom inside it, the idea that kindness could exist without weakness, that strength could come from generosity. The next day, the same cowboys returned with more work orders. Before they left, one of them, a quiet man named Jack, walked up to Ilsa and handed her a small paper bag. Inside were 2 biscuits and a piece of bacon. "My wife made extras," he said simply. All she could manage was a whispered, "Danke." Jack smiled. "You're welcome, ma'am." It was such a simple exchange, but it left Ilsa shaken. That night, she wrote in her journal, "The Americans have something stronger than armies. They have decency." The next week, When she and the other women returned to the ranch, no one was afraid anymore. They walked freely between the fences under the same Texas sun that shone on their guards. It was still a prison, but one that had somehow made them feel human again. By late autumn, the daily rhythm of life at Camp Hearn had settled into something that almost resembled normalcy. But for Ilsa Wagner, normal was the last word she would use. Every week brought another surprise that clashed violently with everything she had been taught back home. In Germany, ration books had ruled life. Every gram of butter, every crumb of bread had to be justified in the name of the Reich. But in Texas, there seemed to be no such thing as scarcity. It began one morning in the camp mess hall. Instead of watery porridge, the cook served eggs, bacon, biscuits with syrup, and black coffee. When Ilsa took her first bite of bacon, she almost cried. It was salty, rich and warm. Later, during lunch, the same abundance appeared. Meat, stew, fresh vegetables, white bread, even dessert. Ilsa felt guilty eating so well while knowing her mother back home was probably standing in line for potatoes. She whispered to Greta, "We were told America was greedy, but they feed even their prisoners better than we fed our soldiers." The following week, another surprise arrived. A shipment of supplies from the Red Cross. Inside were toothbrushes, soap, writing paper, and even small chocolate bars labeled "Gift of the American People." Then came Coca-Cola. One sergeant offered a few bottles to the prisoners for good behavior. Ilsa took a sip and gasped as the fizz hit her tongue. "It burns," she said, laughing despite herself. What stunned her most wasn't the taste. It was the fact that the Americans shared it. They didn't gloat, didn't treat it as charity. They just wanted everyone to enjoy it. When she asked one of the guards why they gave prisoners such luxuries, he shrugged. "Because we can, and because it's the right thing to do." Ilsa couldn't stop thinking about that answer. It was simple, yet it shattered everything she believed about the nature of power. In Germany, strength came from control, from sacrifice. In America, it came from generosity. Weeks later, as she helped wash dishes after another enormous meal, she realized something profound. Abundance wasn't just material, it was cultural. America had built an empire not on fear, but on faith. Faith that there was always enough for everyone. That night, she wrote in her diary, "The Reich built walls, America builds tables." And as the winter winds swept across the Texas plains, the camp felt less like a cage and more like a mirror, reflecting back the world that might have been if compassion had been a weapon all along. By December, rumors had begun to spread through the camp. The guards were planning something special for Christmas. No one believed it at first. Then one morning, the camp loudspeaker crackled to life. "All prisoners will assemble at 1,400 hours for selection." The word selection froze every breath in the room. Ilsa dropped the towel she was folding. Greta clutched her chest. The word didn't belong here. It belonged to another world, a darker one. In their minds, they saw train platforms, barking dogs, and the cold faces of SS doctors pointing left or right. When the guards arrived to escort them to the yard, the women lined up in silence, hearts pounding, eyes fixed on the dirt. Why now? Why Christmas? They marched out under the wide Texas sky. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke. It grew stronger with every step. Then, as they turned the corner, Ilsa saw it. Not a train, not soldiers waiting, but a massive open pit filled with glowing embers. A group of cowboys stood around it, flipping meat on long iron grills. Tables were set with plates, cups, and even flowers. One of the guards grinned and shouted, "Merry Christmas, ladies." The women stopped walking. For a moment, no one understood. Then, one by one, they began to cry. Ilsa covered her mouth, trembling. It wasn't a selection for punishment. It was a selection for barbecue. A sergeant gestured for them to come closer. "You're our guests today," he said. "No work, no orders, just food." Greta burst into tears. "Why?" she asked in broken English. "Why do this?" The man shrugged. "Because it's Christmas. Everyone eats on Christmas." The cowboys served plates stacked with ribs, potatoes, and cornbread. When Ilsa finally tasted the barbecue, the flavor hit her like a wave. Sweet, smoky, tender. It was the best thing she had ever eaten. Around her, women who had been silent for months were laughing. crying, even singing. A cowboy handed her a bottle of Coca-Cola and said, "To peace." She raised it slowly and whispered, "To peace." For the first time, she didn't feel like a prisoner. Later that night, as the fires died down and the stars filled the Texas sky, Ilsa sat on the fence outside her barracks, holding the empty bottle in her hands. She thought about the word that had terrified them that morning. Selection. In Germany, it meant death. In America, it meant dinner. The same word, two worlds apart. She realized then that the war had never truly been about land or power. It had been about humanity, and who still had it left. In that moment, under the quiet of a Texas night, she understood America hadn't just defeated Germany's armies. It had defeated its cruelty. And all it took was a barbecue. The next morning, as dawn broke over the camp, the smell of smoke still lingered in the air. Ilsa Wagner sat by the small window of her barrack, staring at the sunrise. She realized that America's strength wasn't in its armies. It was in its abundance, its mercy, its refusal to mirror the cruelty it faced. She said to one of the cooks as he refilled her coffee, "We thought you wanted to destroy us." "We only wanted to end the war," he replied, "not people." That afternoon, Ilsa wrote her own letter home. "They defeated us," she wrote, "but they never humiliated us. They gave us food instead of punishment, dignity instead of chains." She concluded, "I don't understand them, but I respect them." As the Texas wind carried the faint smell of smoke from the camp's kitchen fires, Ilsa realized something she would carry for the rest of her life, that real victory doesn't come from killing the enemy, but from proving you never became them. Weeks passed, and the Christmas barbecue faded into memory, but its echo lingered. The fear was gone. Ilsa wrote in her final letter before the war ended, "If we ever see peace again, I will tell you what I saw here." When the war finally ended, the announcement came not with trumpets, but with silence. Germany has surrendered. The war in Europe is over. That night, the guards let the women wander within the fence beneath a deep purple Texas sky. Ilsa sat on the wooden steps, watching a group of cowboys laughing near the corral. The same cowboy who had handed her barbecue on Christmas, Tom Whitaker, noticed her and walked over. "War's over," he said simply. "You'll be heading home soon." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object. "Something to remember Texas by," he said. It was a silver spur, worn smooth from years of use. She took it carefully, as if it were made of glass. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just tell people what you saw here." When she boarded the transport weeks later, Ilsa did just that. She left Texas carrying nothing but a small suitcase, a folded Bible, and that silver spur. As the truck rumbled away, she turned to look at the camp one last time. In that moment, she realized that Texas had not been a prison. It had been a lesson. Back in Germany, she told the truth. They gave us food. They gave us dignity. They gave us a piece of their heart. Some didn't believe her, but others listened quietly, the way people do when they hear something they need to believe in. Years later, when she was an old woman, Ilsa visited Texas again. The camp was gone, replaced by wild grass and open sky. She stood there alone, holding the silver spur, feeling the warm wind against her face. She whispered to the emptiness, "You didn't break us. You reminded us how to be human." A lone cowboy rode by in the distance, his horse kicking up dust that shimmered in the evening light. Ilsa Wagner finally understood the real meaning of victory. It wasn't about who won the war. It was about who kept their soul. The story of Camp Hereford lived not in monuments, but in the quiet dignity of people who discovered that mercy could be stronger than hate.